I am very pleased to announce the panelists for this morning's keynote. We have a great lineup here. Starting on my right, Bruce Kuhn is News Director of KQED Public Radio in San Francisco. KQED is one of the top radio stations in the country, and its website is one of the most visited public media sites. He oversees Climate Watch, a multimedia initiative with programs on radio, television, and digital media, and network journalism, a local partnership initiative made possible by a J-Lab grant. To Bruce's right is Joel Dreyfus, managing editor of TheRoot.com, which features news and analysis from an African-American perspective. He is a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists and has more than 35 years of experience in print, broadcast, and online journalism. He has written extensively about race, politics, and the law. To Joel's right, moderator of today's session, Retha Hill, director of the New Media Innovation Lab at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. She is a 2010 Night News Challenge winner and won a 2010 J-Lab Women Entrepreneurs Grant to build a Black History augmented reality mobile app, which I got to beta test. She is the owner of Painted Desert Media, LLC, and speaks frequently about social media and innovation. To Retha's right is Sam Diaz, who's been a professional journalist for more than 20 years. He's covered the tech industry over the past dozen years as a beat reporter, editor, and blogger for the San Jose Mercury News, the Washington Post, and ZDNet. Sam has served as a panelist, moderator, and judge, public speaker, promoting technology, journalism, and diversity efforts. He is a lifetime member and former board member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and the California Chicano News Media Association. To Sam's right, as a digital media consultant, LaToya Peterson has worked with companies such as NPR and Wikipedia. She's worked on projects related to race, pop culture, video games, and recently spoke for the third time at South by Southwest on issues of technology and social justice. A self-declared media junkie, she regularly speaks on topics of race, gender, and social media. Please welcome our panel.
Okay, good morning. How are y'all doing this morning? Well, today we're going to talk about the past, the present, and the future of diversity in digital media. So kind of to get this started, taking a page from Amy Webb's book, I'm going to ask a few questions just to see how much you guys know about, what's happening in diversity in digital media, especially new media, as we used to call it. So I have a few gifts, back in Arizona. I picked up a few things here brought to you. And just shout out the answers if you know it. Just 3 questions just to get us started. First question. When Black Voices first started, it was incubated in this mainstream newspaper. All right. Okay, so you win some really, really hot Arizona hot sauce. Okay. It was the Orlando Sentinel. Okay. All right, girl, come on up here. I'm going to stumble off this stage because of those bright lights. I can't see what I'm doing. Okay. Community Connect created a very successful early social networking network with portals for various ethnic groups. What was the name of the one aimed at Asians? Anybody? For some prickly pear candy brought all the way from Phoenix, Arizona. This is cactus candy. Okay, all right, well the answer was, anybody?
Pacific Time? No.
Oh my God. Asia Avenue? Yeah. Anybody? Okay, all right. Last one. Okay, well I'm gonna give you a bonus one then. Back in the day when, hip hop and young people in New York and LA, Compton, places like that, wanted to connect online, what was the device that they mostly used? Come on, prickly pear candy from Arizona.
Sidekick?
No, Sidekick, come on. Two-way pagers. Everybody was all concerned about the digital divide. Nobody was online, and everybody was hitting each other up, 360 hip-hop, all of that stuff on two-way pagers. Come on. All right, last question. Okay. In 1999, the most ambitious multicultural startup with more than 300 employees and dozens of channels, including Latin flavor and sexy mother, was started by what Hollywood director?
John Singleton.
Nope. Spike Lee? Nope. Come on now. Now this is for my very own iTunes card. It's loaded. Anybody? Robert Townsend? Nope. Okay, in 1999, the most ambitious multicultural startup with more than 300 employees had like $1 million in startup money, dozens of channels for, with Puffy and the Williams sisters, Latin flavor, sexy mother, was started by what Hollywood director?
Wait, Tarantino.
Nope. He actually stroked out like days before his major launch. He died, which was unfortunate. It's not funny.
Richard Pryor now.
Okay, all right. The answer is George Jackson, who directed New Jack City. Yep. Okay, well, I get to take these back home with me. The reason I bring this up is that, we're in a room full of digital, pioneers. And if you think about what you don't know, or about, a time when the internet was much smaller, the web was much smaller. And, we should know this history about people of color and what we were doing. Think about what you don't know then and maybe what you don't know now. So hopefully we can have a really good conversation about diversity, opportunities, missed opportunities, and hopefully we can rethink, where we are now and think about the talent that's out there in the United States, and people are doing so many amazing things, and we want to make sure that we incorporate all those voices as we move forward. So before we get started, I wanted the panel just to kind of, very briefly tell us something that maybe we don't know. We read the bios, we did this, we work here, but tell me something that perhaps we don't know about your careers in terms of being a pioneer with digital media. Bruce?
Whoa. Just something out of the blue?
Yeah, just something that you did, that, in the early days that helped get this digital media started.
Well, part of my career in digital started because of a newspaper strike. Mm-hmm. And it was the fact that being on strike, it would take at least a week to get the desktop publishing set up, and then so we could continue to report. And someone in the crowd said, well, we can do that on the internet in a day. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to create a virtual newsroom, and I was going up to colleagues, and I asked them, are you online? Because I was going to set up an email copy desk flow. And the reply was, yes, my picket duty is at 4 o'clock. And so then I realized there's a real gap in terms of my brethrens at that time.
Great, interesting. Interesting, Joel?
Well, you were talking about George Jackson. I was the editor-in-chief of Urban Box Office in 1999, 2000. It was a fantastic environment. It was black, white, brown, everybody. My kid was a teenager then, and he came there and he stood there and he looked at these people with purple hair and dreadlocks, and I think the chief technology officer went around on rollerblades. We were down in Chelsea in a huge place. We actually raised and spent $35 million during our lifetime as a startup. And we, like many other sites, we died when the .com crash came along and there was no more money to be raised. But that was a really exciting time, and I think it would be it's a kind of an ideal of what I think we're talking about here. Is we had people from all kinds of backgrounds, Japanese American, Chinese American, Filipinos, African American, Caribbean, African, Europeans. The number 2 guy was British, the founders of UBO. And I think that's a model that I still aspire to, and I think is a model for a truly diverse group of people who bring all sorts of exciting ideas and creativity to any enterprise that I'm involved in.
Great, great. 35 million in just in a couple years, right?
A couple of years, yeah.
Y'all didn't know about? Okay. Sam, tell me something we don't know.
Back in 2000, right after Y2K, it was at the San Jose Mercury News, and predominantly a print product. And although the Mercury News had been a leader in online with Mercury Center as part of AOL, sort of early on, but one of the things that the company resisted were the concept of blogs, and there was actually a group of us. Interestingly enough, we were made up of 2 white guys, 1 Latino guy, an African American, an Asian, and a woman. And we were a pretty diverse group, and we fought tooth and nail to get them to let us blog, sort of real time. And unfortunately, at the time, it was a big resistance. Newspapers were really holding back. They wanted to control the content. They didn't want to sort of allow the journalists to. Well, the tone in the blog is different than it would be in a print story, and so the resistance was there. And some of us started doing it on our own anyway, but found that the newspapers really didn't want us to have our own voice outside the publication. Excuse me. But anyway, it was just an interesting time because at that time we were already a diverse group. We were all sort of focused on tech at the time, and really were pushing the limits, even though. We know what happened to newspapers that resisted.
Yeah. Resistance is futile. LaToya?
I suppose my digital journey started when I almost dropped out of high school. I had a really, really rough senior year, and I ended up leaving right after I took my final exams and just barely squeaked by enough to graduate. So I had moved out. I had started working. I didn't intend to go to college. And I was deciding between buying a television or a computer for the place that I was renting. And I was like, I can buy a computer. That'll be better. I might be able to watch shows online. I'd heard about this thing. And, a television can only do one thing, computer can do 2. And so when I talk about how I came to digital and the digital world, it was completely kind of unintentional. Like I was playing games online, I was downloading anime, I was really heavily into Napster and LimeWire, and just messing around with things. I didn't really think that something this huge would come out of it. But it turns out that over the years that I had spent just messing around online, I was also very curious about how people created things. How do you create an anime music video? Which I didn't realize at the time is essentially video editing, right? That other people have walked you through step by step. And I didn't realize a lot of things about blogging and how blogging would actually get you in front of a lot of people, get your work seen. And it's an interesting way to hone yourself as a writer. So I came out completely independently of any kind of mainstream news organization or even college. And so by the time I found Racialicious, I had this weird set of tools that suddenly just fit for the job that I needed.
Great, excellent. Well, we were talking about the old days, the 1990s. So Joel, talk about those early days. I get the question a lot, where were people of color back in the, the mid-90s, the late 90s, the pre-bubble period? Did people of color just sit it out?
Well, not at all. I mean, the funny thing is, I hate to. I don't know if you were ready for a 9 a.m. Black History session, but African Americans have been involved in the industry from the very beginning, even way back before. I think it was early 1960s. Hewlett Packard was still mostly a calculator company. And they asked one of their senior executives to set up a computer lab to see if this new computer stuff had any promise. And his name was Roy Clay. He's an African-American man, still alive, living in Silicon Valley. A few years later, Silicon Graphics came along. It was the first company to make an extremely powerful, affordable workstation that enabled a lot of the special effects that you see on movies and take for granted today. His name was Mark Hanna. He was a black PhD student at Stanford, and the graphic chip was part of his PhD thesis. And he was swept in by entrepreneurs and launched and Silicon Graphics came to be a very influential company. So I think that the point is, and this is a point about American history in general, Albert Murray, a black writer and intellectual, said that African Americans have been involved at the cutting edge of every industry, every movement in this country, whether it was the conquest of the West with the cowboys and the Buffalo Soldiers, the whaling industry, which was 25% black at its peak in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the same thing happened with the internet. A lot of us, like myself, got involved very early in it. There was a site called in 1996. Net Noir was launched by a guy named David Ellington, who's lives in San Francisco today. I was involved with a startup that was a newspaper. But we realized the internet was a coming force, and we launched a website, and I ran a news site for a year between 96 and 97 at a time when there were still very few such sites. Urban Box Office is a good example. There were lots of other sites, and as you know today, African Americans are very highly overrepresented in mobile, in the use of mobile devices. In fact, that's how a majority are getting their internet connection. And Twitter, the tone and style of Twitter has been deeply influenced by the presence of African Americans on it. And so the fact is that a lot of us, it hasn't been in large numbers, but people have played influential roles. And the whole point of this is that everybody's contributed to the digital world. All different groups have contributed, and the worry that I have today is it's so monochromatic today. It's just seemed that history never happened, and that influence never happened. And I think there are just a lot of opportunities being missed.
And why is that? When you go to these TED conferences and NewsFu and other conferences that we know about until recently, you don't see that reflection in terms of people, getting that wisdom, being on the podium, talking about that. It's almost like you said, it just didn't happen. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is that a lot of the way technology is financed, and I think Sam will talk a little bit about that, is very boys club kind of thing. The Silicon Valley venture capitalists tend to invest in people from certain schools, 3 or 4 schools. They tend to invest in guys who are like them, meaning white and male. The club kind of retains that kind of exclusionary environment. It's just that people are not, it's very hard to get funding if you're a woman or if you're a minority still today. You can just look at the numbers. There's no disputing that. The vast majority of money that's being invested in new startups goes to new companies founded by a couple of white guys, and maybe an Asian as a partner, rarely just and completely even just an Asian company, but it tends to be a mixture. So the money is the first thing that flows, and the second thing is people tend to hire people like them, and it takes the kind of special effort. When you look at a company like a Disney, or even the old line news companies that we all used to work for, there was a whole set of social forces that said to these organizations, you can't be just white. The constituency out there is not, what's going on in the world is multiracial, multicultural. There has never been that kind of pressure or demand on the online industry.
And LaToya, despite that, people are innovating. I mean, what's going on now? Who are some of the people out there, doing the thing that we just don't know about and we should know about?
That would take all day to talk about all the great innovations that are happening. But how many people have heard of the New Me Accelerator? Whoa, okay, there's a couple. The New Me Accelerator is actually written up in Forbes, and it is a black web accelerator started by Wayne Sutton. I think Angela Benton's in it. I think Adria Richards. This is a whole crew that I met at the Blacks in Tech meetup at South by Southwest in 2008 or 2009. And a lot of them have doing some emerging, amazing things. Who's ever read .NET Magazine? Okay, well that's a huge magazine for the development of web tools, particularly HTML5. And one of the people I met there, Denise Jacobs, is now has been considered kind of like a forward-thinking thought leader. She did all this amazing work with frameworks back in the 2000s, and now she's leading the HTML5 thing, and they've denoted her as this expert. The CSS Detective Guide, I think, is the thing that she wrote. And so there are so many people doing such great work, and it's interesting to me that people only see the very, very marquee names. Who knows Baratunde Thurston? Okay. Who knows Anil Dash? Okay, getting a few more. But it's very, very limited to exposure to networks, right? When I first got to the blogosphere, I realized how weirdly and strangely segregated it was, right? Where I could talk to my compatriots of color, right? And we would know where each other's stuff was. We would know about Jack and Jill politics. We would know about Asian Pundit. We would know about, Angry Asian Man and all these other things that were happening, people talking about politics and social justice. At the same time, though, if I would go into more white spaces or more traditional spaces and talk about these things, it'd be like we didn't even exist. They had no idea there was an Afrosphere. They had no idea that Latinos might be on MySpace or Mi Gente or any of the thousands of other social networks. And so it's always interesting to me to see how much people don't know and how much we don't talk to each other.
And Sam, we talked about, the difficulty that startups, people of color, when they're trying to start their own businesses, have in getting funding. What's going on here?
Well, I think largely, especially what you're seeing in Silicon Valley is a lot about the network of people that are together, and a lot of that stems from, you think of sort of your own network and how you are sort of connected to people. I mean, a lot of these folks were coming out of the various schools, the big schools, the Harvards and the Stanfords and that sort, and we hear these stories about, Mark Zuckerberg being a dropout and that sort of thing. I mean, these people are sort of connected, and of course they go after the people that they know to sort of help them support the ideas. So I mean, the sort of boys club that we talk about in Silicon Valley, I mean, to a large part, yeah, I think that does exist out there. But I don't think that it's something. This may make me the unpopular guy to say it, but I don't think it's something that's necessarily intentional. I think it's just something that's sort of the culture in Silicon Valley. When they look at diversity, I mean, if you look at sort of the technology industry and diversity, you look at, it's made up, there's a lot of folks that come over from Asia, the Indian population, the engineer, the talent, the sort of technical talent. And so the point being that, in terms of the tech industry, I think that the sort of the big players consider themselves to be diverse already. When they look at not just ethnic diversity, but also cultural and even sexual orientation. I mean, there's a pretty large gay community that's built up within the tech community as well. So they sort of see themselves as diverse already. When we were going back to sort of the news industry side of it, when I was at the Mercury News around Y2K, and we were working with high school students about journalism, and we would target students of color. And I found that the Latino kids mostly, when they come into journalism, they didn't want to cover tech. They didn't want to cover business. They wanted to cover sports. They wanted to cover crime, courts, cops, schools, that sort of thing, because these are areas where they sort of felt like they had been wronged. They weren't necessarily interested in covering things like business or technology, and I think that over time that has changed a little bit. Latinos are one of the largest segments of the population that use smartphones, that are online, that are doing social networking, and so I think that has sort of changed and shifted a little bit, and hopefully as the tech industry continues to grow, that we'll see a changed sort of makeup of that industry as well. But I think it's sort of a complex sort of thing that has grown, and it still needs to continue to grow. There's still a long way to go. Okay,
all right. And Bruce, this is the Online News Association, so let's talk about, media and, what's happening with diversity there. I mean, you were at Knight Ridder, you've been around for a long time. When it comes to diversity in digital media, how does it compare to what used to be, in terms of the push in legacy media? Are we seeing, is it different? Is it better now? Is it the same? Or is it, worse than it used to be?
Well, I think, as when we were getting together for this panel, one reason we wanted to provide a historic perspective was not to wax nostalgic or to talk about what we're familiar with, but there is definitely a linkage between what came before and what some of the challenges and issues we're talking about here. Because, we were talking about that it's surprising that we're now in a technological time and all of you are living and dying by metrics. and yet we don't have a lot of metrics to measure where the diversity issues are within journalism. You know, a quick reminder that the premise that I think was stated here, that a diverse workforce, a diverse staff is what is necessary in order to get that inclusion of ideas that go beyond a single focus. So in the newspaper industry, which at one time dominated journalism, it became incumbent to actually measure the progress. So the American Society of Newspaper Editors since 1978 has been doing this survey of, you know, how many minorities are in your newsroom. And the last results just came out in April of 2011. And for 3 straight years, minorities in newsrooms have been declining. It's now less than 13% of what's left of our newsrooms in America, at least in terms of newspapers. And it's been a 3rd straight year of decline. It's nowhere near the goal that the American Society of Newspapers Editors had set to have by the year of 2025 news journalists that represented the same percentage of the population of minorities in America, which is about 38%. So the point of that is, at some point, it's not just the goodwill. What are the metrics, what are the programs to get us to that goal? And I think, as Joel referred to it, one time at least we had an industry where you knew where to apply the pressure points. I mean, and you had associations that had developed along those lines, the National Association of Black Journalists, the Asian American Journalists Associations, Hispanic. And you had constituencies both in your communities because of the local areas and populations where you could put pressure points and at least hold accountable your local newspaper, your local television. That's all changed, as we know in this room. Now, as Joel referred to, we have this very dispersed, this very desolate kind of media structure where I'm not quite sure how these pressure points or even this discussion begins to take place. So that's one of the things I'm wondering about, as you said, on measuring. And as new forces come to be that are the new media folks who may have not been perceived in that shape, what obligations do they have? I don't know if anyone's here from America Online, and I don't want to single them out because the press reports I read aren't complete. But, you know, one small example of the change in the politics of all this, I guess Richard Prince of the Maynard Institute noted that when Patch and America Online were launched last year, they were proclaiming we're the new engine for journalism. And so Richard Prince asked, well, while you're doing that, what's your diversity policy? How much of your percentage are you going on this? And as reported by the press, the press release at that time was that we don't put race and ethnicity into our hiring, we just hire the best journalists. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, race and ethnicity and gender have to be part of any kind of equation in journalism. Part of being a good journalist is viewing our coverage area and see what's not being reported or who's not being included. Even in a day of mashups and crowdsourcing, there's a certain self-selection process that goes on. So our duty as journalists is to continue to help curate and mediate that experience. So I'll give you one small example. At KQED, we're covering the San Francisco mayoral campaign. And as part of having that two-way conversation with your audience today, we sent reporters, our social media experts out into different neighborhoods to tape voices, to get a wide variety of voices on what the next mayor of San Francisco should be concerned about, and have them fill out a survey form that we're going to use and participate out. So we did that. But afterwards, we had to do an analysis. Did we get a good cross-section of San Francisco? Did we get a mix? Is it young and old? Is it diverse ethnically? And we had to send a second wave out. We couldn't just rely on going out and sourcing. So the final point I want to make is, I think there are toolkits that worked in old journalism organizations that are still valid today. It's not just about the hiring, that's one issue we've talked about, but the kind of news you do, where are you doing a constant content evaluation to understand, are we reaching all the points that we want to do? Are you doing a content analysis? And the other is your beat coverage. of what is being left out and being very conscious of adding that in.
Well, Bruce, and I'm going to throw this out to the entire panel, but is the onus on these digital media companies to, hire people of color and make sure their staffs are diverse? Because after all, I mean, this is digital media. You can start your own thing. I mean, any one of us could have started Facebook, Politico, a Huffington Post. After all, if Tunisians can get their voices heard via Twitter and Facebook, why is it important for news organizations to hire people of color when we can just do our own thing, get our perspective out there in a way that we couldn't do back in the day?
Well, it's one other history lesson to get to that point, because again, part of the diversity movement, at least in the American newspaper industry, as we all recall, sprang out of the civil rights movement, because suddenly you had American cities burning. And there was the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times realizing they had no reporter they could send out to one of the most violent areas of their city without putting that person in danger. And so, there's famous stories, and I don't have all the details. Maybe, Joel, you'll recall, I think in the Harlem riots in the 60s, where the New York Times said we had no one we could send out there in good conscience to protect. And that's actually where a number of, I think, pioneer black journalists for the Times got their start, because suddenly they were pulled out. Similar story happened in Los Angeles.
Washington.
In Washington, D.C. That was the other famous example. So I think to read your point, again, without the inclusion in the newsroom of both the physical aspect of those perspectives, how else do you begin to cover that very wide breadth of landscape that you're attempting to do?
I would argue that digital newsrooms have a greater need for diversity than the sort of traditional newspaper newsrooms of 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and largely because the audience is greater. So if you're the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times, 20 years ago you had a very limited readership. I mean, they reached your community, and your sort of responsibility was to cover your community and reflect the people that made up. So if you're in Los Angeles, that's a very large Latino population, as opposed to, say, somewhere in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay, it's a much smaller. But as these issues, and you take issues such as immigration, poverty, education, these are sort of issues that cross over into all populations now, regardless. So if you're a digital newsroom and your audience is now global, it's no longer limited to the sort of the 4 counties in the Los Angeles region. If that audience is greater, your responsibility now to provide fair, balanced, accurate news coverage of all issues, whether it's, again, immigration, education, whatever it is, that balance is even greater because your audience is greater. And the only way you do that, and it sort of goes back to the old lessons of newspaper days, is to have the staff not only that's reporting it and going out onto the beat and going out into the streets and talking to the people, but also the people that are in those news meetings every day and making the decisions of what's going to be on whether it's the front page or the home page, what sort of play it's going to get. There are issues. The best example I can always think of is in the Mercury News newsroom. There was a woman, a Latina, who was an editor. And she was part of that daily newsroom, and Celia Cruz had died. And it didn't really register with anybody else in the room except for her. And she was like, "Are you kidding? This is front page news. This has to go on the front page. Why would we not?" And it was because of her and her presence in that room that day that important story made the front page of the paper. Mm-hmm. And without her in those meetings, you can dispatch all the reporters that you want into communities of color, if you will, or whatever it may be, but unless you have somebody that's also at the news director, the decision-making level, those stories could just get lost in digital newsrooms and in traditional newsrooms, either way.
But
I don't want to make it sound like, I'm afraid that we can make it sound like you have to take this pill, like some kind of bitter medicine that you have to take. In the 60s, yes, I was one of those guys hired because of the riots. I had a lot more hair then, so, and it was okay to go out and do these stories. But I think look, it's more interesting. People who are minorities contribute culturally. People listen to hip hop, they listen to jazz. There's a huge amount of creativity that comes out of these minority communities. just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times, just before Fashion Week, New York Times ran a story about two young guys who run a blog, two young black guys from Brooklyn who run a blog about fashion that everybody reads in the fashion industry. And they know, you know, I'd not heard of them, but they were in the paper. And I thought, you know, this is the kind of story you dig up if you're close to an industry, if you're looking in the unusual places, if you're not taking for granted that, you know, all wisdom comes from Harvard and Stanford. You know, there are a lot of things. I just think it makes it more interesting. Breaking news, news stories, new ideas, new trends. So much of that is from the contributions of immigrants and minorities that I just think it makes a more interesting product, whatever it is you produce, if you have input from these people and you write about what they're up to.
Right, and to build on what Joel is saying, you know, from my perspective, having never worked in a large news organization, right, been completely kind of indie in the blogosphere, our audience is not what most people expect. A lot of times I notice that mainstream organizations always assume they're writing to a predominantly white audience. Our audience is 70% of color and a third international, as in originating from places that are outside of the US. So automatically, the framework that we have to present and the way in which we present stories and we look at the content that we're going to cover and how we're going to cover it has to be different. We have to kind of completely disassemble our assumptions about what kind of stories we think are going to be there and really pay attention to what people are looking for us to cover. And this was really, you know, put clear to me with the London riots. Now, Racial Issues is all volunteer. We've been running for 6 years. We have about 240,000 unique viewers a month, which works out to about 10,000 people hanging on our site per day, anywhere between like 5,000 and 10,000 depending on schools in session, et cetera, et cetera. But they came to us for a very specific need, a very specific niche. They want to see themselves reflected in media. They don't want to see the mainstream lens. They don't want to see the white lens. And they don't, more increasingly, want to see the Western lens in terms of, hey, our people of color perspectives, and looked at what we really needed to present. The first person who filed was an American who had moved to Birmingham, or moved to London. She lives in this place called the Jewelry District. And the very first file I got was something a little bit more in line with what was running on major news organizations. Essentially what she was saying was that comparisons that people were making on Twitter and on Tumblr and things like that to London being another part of the Arab Spring and you know, it's young people rising up was kind of off. And she was like, this is about looting, it's about people getting trainers, this is not the revolution that you think it is, right? And so, you know, she talked about her testimony. We published it as the first piece. We had a second piece running 2 hours after that and a third perspective running another 4 hours after that. And our readers revolted. And what they said specifically to us is, this is what I would expect to see at a mainstream news organization. This is what I would expect to see, and I don't expect this from Racial Issues. I expect something more nuanced. I expect something more from our perspective. Despite the fact that the person who wrote this is essentially a third culture kid, an African American, Caribbean descended, now British person, right? So despite that fact, that the representation there didn't make the difference. They were looking for a particular framework and a perspective that was going to deconstruct the historical aspect of why the riots were happening. What's going on politically in London is what my readers wanted to know. And why are so many youth of color disenfranchised, and what is happening with that? And so the second piece by Nicole, who was another blogger, put them more in context and talked a little bit about the different areas, what was happening. And then we reached out to a guy named Casey Rain, who was a musician, who started putting up a Tumblr that was just reports on what was happening, rioting, looting, and his own personal testimony as being harassed by the police and being a non-traditional news person, being a minority in the inner city, and being suspected automatically, and that kind of rage and the pain that's happening despite the fact that the city is being torn apart. And so they responded much better to those types of articles, right, than they did to what would be more in line with traditional media, more in line with what traditional media would pick up. The same thing happened, we noticed we did our interracial dating series, partially because the media for the last like 18 months has been really like wailing on this black women are single, black women are single, black women are single, oh my God, black women are gonna die alone article that's appeared everywhere. Like, I haven't been single in 5 years, and I'm like, oh my God, am I gonna die alone? Like, is he gonna die? Are we gonna be okay? Like, it was so weird, and it's like almost every single major news outlet has run some variation of this story.
Right.
And my readers are like, what is this mess? Can we do something else? And so I was like, okay, open call. Let's see who comes out. And we heard from like queer South Asians who were talking about caste system drama and like the whole issue, can you even date? We had Asian Americans talking about the focus in dating construction in America being very different from dating construction in like Korea and Japan, where they were from. We had African Americans talking about what does it mean to be queer in their community, what does it mean to not see marriage as a final solution to all of the black community problems.
Latoya, and I want to get Dory Maynard from the Maynard Institute up here to talk about a new study that they just released. But Dory, if you could come up and get ready here, but why not just, since you have blogs and sites like Racial Issues, why can't mainstream media or the Huffington Post, whatever, just link to you? This whole thing, why is it important to...
Because somebody has to sustain us. Like those of us who are on the outside, we do not have these resources and we burn out really, really fast.
Gotcha.
I'm sure you guys are already, many of you are probably at the burnout points in your job at some point, just because the level of work, detail, and things that you need to do to make something quality is tough. And so unless we get bought out, there isn't really something that goes.
Yeah,
and
Bruce, come on in. And Dory,
really quickly to that point, and picking up Joel, I agree on the creative part, but I'm going back to the Stern master on the pill, maybe. Not a hard pill, but again, how do we begin to implement policies and the technology? One area I mentioned, ongoing content inventory. Technology should be the place to begin giving me a source list as we develop in our newsroom of who we go to have speak all the time. And if you look at some of the databases in your newsroom right now, it's probably the same old people. So I'm looking for technology to begin to assist me on how do I find resources and experts of all colors, races, and gender, not just to speak on racial issues, but when we have a topic on politics or science, that is a diverse aspect as well. So I think there are, and again, this doesn't happen in the newsroom unless it becomes a priority. Historically, again, Newhouse of Gannett actually made all of his newspapers go back and redo their source lists and said, every newspaper article, I want to see a reflection of our audience in there, regardless of the subject matter.
Right.
So I think those are some of the opportunities we're missing.
And Dory, talk a little bit about this study. Just in a couple minutes, because I want to get to some questions here in terms of what are you seeing when there's perhaps not an emphasis on diversity.
Well, and I think it makes a difference because without the emphasis on diversity, it determines, what stories we tell ourselves. And just to give you all a little bit of background about the Maynard Institute, we are the nation's oldest organization that's dedicated to helping news organizations fairly, accurately, and credibly cover all segments of our society. And when we, because as my father used to say, it gets back to this, we can't be the country we want to be if our story is told by only one group of citizens. So our goal is to give all Americans front door access to the truth. And when we started about 35 years ago, we had a print focus. Now, of course, we're shifting to the digital focus, but what we're seeing is that there are some alarming similarities. When we used to do content audits for print publications, we found that people of color were overrepresented in sports, crime, and entertainment. And in the last 6 months or so, we've been using our fault lines framework, which is our diversity framework that looks at diversity through race, class, gender, generation, and geography, to look at how people of color are depicted on sort of the mainstream sites versus how they're depicted on the sites geared toward an ethnic audience like Joel's sites. And we're finding very similar patterns for African Americans. An example, Yahoo News did a story on crime and reports of crime in the wake of Hurricane Irene, and the picture they used, as you can see, is a picture of a lone African American man walking down a flooded road with an abandoned bicycle there. And I'm talking specifically about African Americans because at least we're depicted, no matter how distorted. Latinos are really only found in stories on immigration, and our Asian American and Native American friends simply don't exist. And I have a couple of screenshots of some of the sites that we've been looking at. Slate, and as you can see, there are no people of color. Daily Beast, it's another day, no people of color. And maybe that's a good thing, because one day I went on the Daily Beast and there was one feature that included people of color, but it was on grunting tennis stars. So, Now, by contrast, if you look at the sites like Joel's and Joel's competition, which he will quickly go by.
Competition is a good thing.
But you do see, you see us in sort of our more nuanced complexity and our everydayness, which I really think helps to further our conversation about who we are. So as everyone else continues the conversation, and we're going to get to solutions, right?
Yeah. Well, we're hopefully, I think
But I
there's
want to leave with one thought, one other quote from my father, because I think this issue really does have some urgency to it. And his other quote, often when talking about things like this, is there's nothing to it but to do it. So let's go ahead and do it.
Yep.
And as we go forward, I hope you'll see us as a resource. Contact us for ways we can help you or things we should be doing. And my colleagues, well, they're somewhere, Evelyn Sue and Elizabeth Pino. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dory. Well, at this point, let's open it up for questions, comments from the audience about this whole question. Do we have a mic or, up here? Okay, but I think we want to record you. So we're just going to get this girl a workout if she runs up to get you on the mic here.
Good morning. I'm Alicia Stewart with CNN, and I also help organize the New York City chapter of ONA. It's good to be here. I have a offering and a question. My offering is, LaToya earlier mentioned the new accelerator group that is in Silicon Valley that just was kind of created because it was a group that wanted to launch their own opportunities, and actually CNN is doing a documentary on that group. We followed them throughout the summer, so check out that documentary at an ONA NYC meetup, October 26th, and it airs on November 13th. And my question is around the goals that everybody's kind of alluded to. I'm curious, what are the strengths within the digital space that will help meet some of the goals you allude to, and what are specific goals that you see within this space in terms of reaching diversity or equity or however you define that?
Well, I think one of the, when the internet came along, I mean, the first thing people said is, okay, we've suddenly gotten rid of the biggest obstacle to creating a news entity, which was distribution costs. It used to be if you started a newspaper or magazine, you had to, if you had a newspaper, you had to have delivery trucks, you had to have printing presses, magazines, you have to basically you pay newsstands to carry your publication. The internet came along and, you can sit in your garage, in your room, or, wherever you are and create content. So the theory, in reality, what we've of course found out since is that marketing costs still exist. Or ways of social network, using social networks or other ways to make people aware of what you have is still an obstacle, But I think that the fact that the cost of creation of content is so much lower and so accessible to so many people is the reason that you can have many more voices. I think the issue we have is how do we get those voices on your networks? How do we get those people included, those stories included? And my concern is America today exists in a kind of intellectual apartheid where we don't talk to each other. We don't address each other's issues. And we have, like LaToya says, we have a separate channel and dialogue going on among black folks, Hispanic folks, Asian folks, but there's not a lot of cross-pollination and confrontation of each other. I'd rather somebody tell us that our story ran on this route that is full of it than the complete silence that we usually get from the mainstream sites.
Right.
So what's the goal then?
The goal is to open these channels and these networks, and let's talk, let's look at each other's stuff, let's comment on it, let's argue.
Right.
Let's start a debate, at least,
I think that part of the goal, it depends on, I think, where you sit. If you come from a traditional news organization, and I should mention here that Rachel has been really, really lucky where we've had a lot of support from friends like Alicia Stewart at CNN. She really helped us out early on. We were getting established. The Utney Reader was great. WNYC was great in terms of not only, linking to us, but also answering our questions. We don't know anything about, at the time, we didn't know anything about what we were starting and running, like what are the legal ramifications for asking like a guest coming on, like how do you even organize, a regular session, and they gave us their knowledge, which was really, really valuable to us. So for some folks in the digital space, the goal is to be big, to be bought out, to have your blog be a platform so that you can get into the NPRs of the world and the New York Times of the world and your local paper, and that people will notice your work. For some of us and others of us, we've started looking at media ownership as a way in which that this will work, because we just feel like the structures that are in place right now, it's kind of like you're trying to just push a full boulder up the hill. It's probably not going to work. And the way in which we've been operating, if we could just figure out how the funding models work on our end, we'd be better suited to serve our audiences by staying independent. So it just depends. I feel like there's different goals depending on where you sit in this kind of ecosystem.
Okay, let's get another question.
Hi there. Ooh, whoa, this is loud. Matilde Piard at Cox Media Group. I have a question. The company I work for has decided that diversity is a huge priority for us because we don't think we're diverse enough yet. And so I was, for example, asked to be part of a committee to try to figure out once we are able to become more diverse, how do we get more job applicants. And I feel like this is kind of like the argument that, conferences often give when they're not diverse enough or they don't have enough diversity in their panels. They're like, oh, well, not a lot of diverse people applied. And I feel like that's not a very good argument. And so what can media companies do to attract people to apply and to what are the companies that are known for their diversity, and what have they done in order to be diverse and known for their diversity, I guess is my question.
Well, I think the first thing is you take that first step. You know that you should hire people who are different, who can bring a different perspective, and there are universities, Howard, FAMU, Hampton, Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School, which we have a high number of Latino students. So young people coming out of school, look at the student newsroom here at ONA is very diverse, Egyptian and African American and Latino and people from different walks of life. You open up the doors and you actively go after people. And I think that, years ago you would go to an NABJ or NAHJ, conference, and organizations were there recruiting because they wanted to make sure they got the best and brightest in of different ethnic groups. And talk to those of us who are, here at this conference to give you names. We started a list of, people who are of color and working in the digital space already. So if you want people who are more mature and have been doing it for a while, everything from CTOs to people who are in ad sales to people who are content producers, multimedia producers. I mean, at BET.com, I started out in 1999 where there were very few people of color doing content producing. I grew my own. I hired them from hip hop magazines and taught them how to do content production. And so those people are out there now and been doing it for 15 years or so. So there are just so many ways. And then there are the organizations, the unity organizations that are, starting now to train people in digital. Bruce.
But one of the lessons that we as news people have learned about our audience, you use the word, how do we attract? As you know, we don't attract audiences anymore. Part of our job is to go where the audience is. So the same notion of building a diverse staff and finding new sources and new recruits, you have to go out to where they are now. And even if they're not media, where is the community concerns? We can borrow some lessons from our citizen journalists. Go to where the communities are, and if there's not media savvy or training, that's what you're going to help provide. So just the word attract, I think the formula has changed. You need to go out where the communities are and develop it from there.
Okay.
And I don't think you can really underscore the significance of the unity groups, the Hispanic journalists, Black journalists, Asian Americans. I mean, I was at the NAHJ conference in Orlando, and the job fair was very light. There weren't a lot of companies there recruiting, and yet the diversity within this group has grown. And when we think of diversity a lot, we think of color and culture. Just within NAHJ, you had journalists now who were interested in sports and crime and the economy and finance and digital and tech and business and everything that sort of goes with it. So within that group, there's diversity, and there's a strong network. I can't speak for the other groups, but for NAHJ and I guess Unity too, there's a strong networking going on right now because those groups feel like they've been disproportionately hit by the downturn. So there's a lot of mid-career professional journalists who are quite capable, and they would welcome you at their conferences as well.
Right, and
One
also
last
just
question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
For those of us, a lot of us on the web are also outside of these traditional structures. So I didn't think of myself as a journalist for many, many years, and I had never joined NABJ or any of the normal, routes. And so for a lot of us, people found us just through Google, looking at Technorati, hitting up tech conferences. A lot of us go to South by Southwest, and so kind of expanding the places where you would look for talent is also very key.
Exactly. One last question here.
Good morning. Alita Crawley from E! The People. I am also one of the organizers of the ONA New York City group. Just one comment and a question. One of the things that we do locally, our group is composed of a wide variety of ethnicities and genders, or two genders, I should say. But when we're putting together panels locally, we also try to have some diversity on every single panel. So every single time people are presented, they're not seeing the same faces. They're seeing different faces, hearing different points of view. I do remember from my newspaper days that USA Today made a commitment that every single day, above the fold on the paper, front page, there would be a picture of a minority or a positive story. And as I've checked, they have kept that promise. What I'd like to know is if there are any models out there or companies that you think are doing it right and are seeking to take this going forward and make sure that there's a diversity of ideas.
I love Al Jazeera at this moment. Al Jazeera English they are amazing. The stream. Is Derek around? I don't know if he's still here. But the stream is amazing in terms of incorporating all these different types of perspectives and having a very diverse staff in a workplace. And since I am also on the staff of ONA, I will be writing about the diversity strategies and media strategies of Al Jazeera so that we can all read about it and learn from them. But they are my new favorite media company at the moment.
I couldn't hear you. Seb?
I was saying, make sure to make the point that some people put people on a panel from another country and say that's diversity. They'll say, Dr. Sib from Belmont University, some people put people on panels and positions from other countries and will say that satisfies diversity. They'll put somebody from Ireland or Australia and say, hey, we've got diversity on this panel. That's another thing we're running into as we're looking at these international as well as domestic panels here in the U.S. and digital startups as well.
Well, it's time for us to wrap it up. I want to thank you all for coming, but let's leave with this one thought that as we move into 2012, we've got national elections coming up. Let's redouble our efforts, or start our efforts to create diversity in our digital newsrooms, in our organizations, talk to people, reach out to each other, because there are a lot of talent out there who can help you, create the type of company that I think we all want and need in this country. The stakes are high, and we need to make sure, especially in our political coverage and what's going on with the economy, that we're including all these voices. We cannot leave groups of people behind. And it's also, there's an economic reason, because we know what's happening in this country. We know how this country is browning up, and you need to make sure that you're reaching an audience that can continue to buy your product and continue to provide you content and to be part of the conversation. So it's really important that we embrace this and move forward. Thank you so much for coming.